So what are the New York Giants going to do now about center? We're going to explore the answer to that question. Plus, we're going to hear from Locked On Jets host John Butchko about new receiver Jeff Smith. And we'll also answer a listener question coming up next on the Locked On Giants podcast.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily New York Giants podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, New York Giant fans, and welcome to another edition of the Locked On Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast family, your team every day. I'm your host, Patricia Traina. Welcome to the midweek edition of Locked On Giants. And today's episode of the Locked On Giants podcast is brought to you by Ultimate Football GM. If you've ever dreamed of becoming an NFL GM and managing your football franchise, then this game is definitely for you. To download the game, just visit ultimate-gm.com or look it up in the app stores. Our listeners get a 100% free boost to their franchise when using the promo code Locked On in the game. And that's in all caps, by the way. So check out the game. It's quite addictive. And I think you will find it a lot of fun. I know I've been finding it a lot of fun, so highly recommend it. All right. On today's Locked On Giants podcast, what are the Giants going to do at center? We're going to talk about that. We're going to hear from John Butchko of Locked On Jets. He's going to tell us a little bit about Jeff Smith, one of the unrestricted free agents that the Giants signed, who we haven't quite covered yet. And then I'm going to answer a couple of listener-submitted questions that I received via Twitter. But we got to solve or try to come up with a plan at any rate for the Giants at center, because as you guys know, the Giants lost Nick Gates to the Commanders. They lost John Feliciano to the 49ers. That news coming out on Monday. And that news, quite honestly, was probably the second surprise of free agency for the Giants, because I really thought the Giants were going to re-sign Feliciano for another year, but such is not the case. So what now for the Giants? Now, you're probably sitting there saying, well, duh, Pat, it's going to be the draft. But who in the draft? And above all, where in the draft? And if they do go in the draft, which I think they will, are these guys going to be ready? Or do they need to bring in a veteran? So we're going to talk about all that. I'm going to give you what I think is going to happen. If you want to agree, disagree, you know what to do. Send me a letter, drop a comment in the comment box below if you are watching on YouTube. But it's a question we need to explore. So let's do that. All right. So I have been saying probably for the longest time now that the ideal scenario for the Giants at center is to have a veteran in place. And again, I thought it would be John Feliciano, but that's not going to be the case. And to draft at the position, because as I pointed out, I think on yesterday's show, or it might have been on the show before that, I know I pointed it out somewhere. It was on Twitter. Okay, it was on Twitter. I pointed it out. The Giants haven't had the same starting center since Weston Richburg in 2016 and 2017. Now, that's not necessarily good, because you want your quarterback and center to be like an old married couple, to where they anticipate what the other guy's going to do. If you're the Giants and you're committed to quarterback Daniel Jones, which apparently they are, given the contract that he got, you've got to address that offensive line. I think we can all agree on that. You've got to fix the interior of that offensive line. And the fact that the Giants haven't prioritized the interior of that offensive line basically screams that they're going to go draft. And I'll talk about the draft prospects in just a minute. But here's what I also can see happening. Now, currently, I think the only guy on the Giants roster under contract who has played center before is Ben Bredesen. And he's only played in 30 snaps during the regular season at the position. Not a whole lot. Now, that doesn't mean anything, because last year, as you guys know, Feliciano had been pretty much a career guard, and he made the conversion to center, and wasn't horrible, but, they could have upgraded, and I think they intended to upgrade all along. But here's the thing, center in the NFL is probably one of the toughest positions to play on the offensive line because you're making the line calls. You're basically orchestrating everything. And I've always maintained that the best course of action for the Giants is to get a veteran, to draft at the position, and, at some point transition to the young guy and let that guy just grow old with the rest of your offensive line and your quarterback. So let's talk about the veteran aspect first. Now, I looked at Over the Cap to see, because they have a pretty good free agency tracker. And there's really not a whole lot there that I think you can get excited about. I'll give you one name that is currently an unrestricted free agent, but, he's had some injury issues, and we'll see if he lands any place. I mean, I haven't heard a whole lot in terms of, any interest other teams have had since he's been released. And that could be maybe because, is he still dealing with concussions? And that is former Titans center Ben Jones, who is over the age of 30, but, who has been a pretty good center. Now, again, the simple fact that I haven't heard of much interest in Jones out there on the open market, that's kind of, I don't want to say a red flag, but it does raise a flag for me. Now, another guy to keep an eye on, and this is if he gets released. Now, there have been reports that the Colts may be looking to move Ryan Kelly, their center. They apparently have been trying to trade him, according to reports. And if they can't trade him, there has been a report that they may release him. Now, here's the thing. Ryan Kelly, who from 2019 to 2021, I believe, was a Pro Bowler, so a very good center. He just collected a $1 million roster bonus on March 19th. Not a lot of money, but, still, if the Colts were really desperate to move him and they couldn't find a trade partner, you wonder if they maybe would have looked to cut him earlier and save that $1 million. But again, $1 million to you and me maybe is a lot of money, but, to the Colts, who I think let me just check their cap space situation. I think the Colts are in pretty good shape cap wise, but I'll double check that. The Colts have, right now about 12.685 million in effective cap space. So what's 1 million to them? It's nothing. So here's the thing. If the Colts were to pick up a younger center, and it is possible that they could be looking to pick up a younger center, might they, if they are not able to trade Ryan Kelly, might they look to release him? And might the Giants look to pounce if that happens? You might say, well, why don't the Giants just trade for the guy? I don't think they're going to do that. I mean, they've already made the trade for Darren Waller. It was only at the third round pick, but unless the Giants could get away with maybe trading, I don't know, one of their fifth round picks or a seventh round pick, as a conditional pick, how many more guys do you think the Giants might want to trade from this draft class coming up? It's possible. I mean, I'm not ruling it out, but, would you want to make that trade knowing that you're probably going to take a young guy in the draft anyway? And really you're just trading for a Ryan Kelly who might be just like a 1-year rental. I don't know. I'd have a hard time justifying that, but that's just my take. So that leads me to the draft. What will the Giants do, or what can they do in the draft? Y'all know that I'm a big fan of John Michael Schmitz of Minnesota, who, by the way, Minnesota, the last time the Giants drafted a center in the first round was Brian Williams in 1989 out of Minnesota. So the University of Minnesota has been good to the Giants when it comes to centers. I went and I looked up some of the rankings of the top centers in this draft. And John Michael Schmitz has often been touted as the most NFL ready out of all those who have played center. But interestingly enough, NFL Draft Bible has given him a third round grade. He's also NFL Draft Bible's second ranked center. NFL.com appears to have given Schmitz a second round grade. So why do I mention this? Well, whereas I at one point thought, well, maybe the Giants will just draft a center in the first round. I don't know that will be the case. And the more I looked at the rest of the centers, and I'm going to talk about a couple more that might be prospects, I think the Giants wait till the second round to get their center. So let's talk about a couple of other prospects that could be on the Giants' radar. Joe Tippmann from Wisconsin. He was ranked as the number one center by NFL Draft Bible. Interestingly enough, he got a fourth round grade from them. I'm not sure how that is the case, but Schmitz, I think, had the third round grade from NFL Draft Bible. But the point being is none of these centers that I'm mentioning got first round grades, and not just from Draft Bible, but also from NFL.com. So, Tippmann, comes from Wisconsin, which obviously that school is very well known for producing quality offensive linemen. He could be a guy to keep an eye on, especially if, Schmitz isn't there, or maybe Schmitz isn't the right fit for the Giants. They don't feel he's the right fit. Maybe they go with Tippmann. So that's a guy to keep an eye on. Another guy, a third option to keep an eye on, is Steve Avila from TCU. Now, Steve Avila got a fifth round grade. I don't think, by the way, these grades that these three guys got, I don't think they're going to hold true. I think they maybe are going to go a little higher than where they're currently projected. But Steve Avila, who has guard and center capabilities, I mean, you want to get him used to the NFL. Maybe you plug him in, I don't know, at left guard. And then, you make the transition at some point to center. I mean, that's what the Giants did with Weston Richburg back in the day. I mean, more so because there was an injury involved. I think Jeff Schwartz at the time was on the roster, and I think he had an injury, and they pretty much had to throw Weston Richburg into the mix, into the fire at guard, even though I'm not sure he had a whole lot of experience playing the position. So you've got three prospective centers here, all of whom are, the top three on NFL Draft Bible, NFL.com. You got to think logic would dictate that at least one of those guys should be there for the Giants in the second round. So what about the first round? Here's the thing. I wouldn't rule out for the Giants in the first round a cornerback. I've been saying that for a long time now, because the cornerback class is so deep, and they could potentially get a future starter who will stick around even after the Giants move on from Adoree Jackson. I would also not rule out if there is a receiver that falls down to them, a top-ranked receiver. I could see that being the case. This is where it gets really tricky, because you talk about best player available. And to me, that's such a misnomer, because if the best player available is a quarterback, you really think the team's going to take a quarterback in the first round? I don't. So, I'm not totally ready to say at this point it's going to be a center at number 25. I would not be surprised if it is, but I still wonder if it's going to be cornerback. And I've said this, consistently, I think, that when I do my mock draft, I'm going to probably go corner and center in that order for my first two picks. Which pick I make remains to be seen. But I think those are the top two needs for the Giants. I mean, certainly center is a priority. And this plan of, bringing in a veteran center to kind of pave the way for the youngster, I don't think that's a bad plan necessarily. So, I know, if you take a first round pick, you want to get them into the lineup on day one. Ideally, you want to get your second round pick into the lineup on day one, too, if you can. But if you don't right away, it's not the end of the world, especially if you consider where the Giants are picking. They're going to be picking towards the end of the second round. So it's almost like a late second round, early third round type of pick, where Maybe you get guys that are, have the same grade and they're all in a cluster. So that's how I kind of see it playing out. But interestingly enough, I think we'll say this much. The fact that the Giants, as of this recording, and I'm recording this on a Tuesday afternoon, the fact that the Giants have not yet addressed the offensive line tells me they might as well take out a billboard in Times Square saying we're drafting a center, because I really think that's the direction that things are headed. So we will see. All right, Giant fans, coming up next, John Butchko of Locked On Jets joins me. And he's going to answer some questions about Jeff Smith, one of the unrestricted free agents the Giants picked up. We'll find out a little bit more about Jeff coming up right after this. Hey, Giant fans, General Manager Joe Schoen still has a lot of tough decisions to make in the coming weeks about free agency, the draft, and so forth as they look to build a dynasty over in East Rutherford. And speaking of building a dynasty, if you think you have what it takes to build a dynasty of your own, then you got to try Ultimate Football GM. When you play Ultimate Football GM, you get to control every aspect of your franchise, from drafts, the trades, to coaching hires, to uniforms, to medical staff, you name it, you are in control. And this game, very addictive, by the way. I've started playing it recently and it is really addictive. Lets you build the franchise to your vision as you attempt to create a dynasty to give even the best NFL GMs a run for their money. And right now, when you download the game, you can get a 100% free boost for your franchise with the promo code Locked On. When you put that on all caps, when you register for a new account. So what are you waiting for? Find the Ultimate Football GM in the App Store or visit ultimate-gm.com. And don't forget to enter that promo code Locked On in all caps to get your free boost. Ultimate Football GM, start your dynasty today. Hey, Giant fans, thanks so much for making the Locked On Giants podcast your first listen every day. Now, for your second listen, check out the Locked On NFL Scouting podcast with the Draft Dudes. From free agency to the draft to salary cap management and much more, NFL experts Kyle Krabs and Joe Marino take you through what it's like to build a successful NFL franchise. Their show airing every Monday through Friday. Find a Locked On NFL Scouting podcast with the Draft Dudes wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right, Giant fans, welcome back to the Locked On Giants podcast. And I'm now pleased to be joined by my colleague over at Locked On Jets, John Butchko, who is going to tell us about Jeff Smith. John, thanks so much for joining me on the program.
Oh, glad to be here.
So, John, what can you tell us about Jeff Smith?
Well, he was signed as an undrafted free agent out of Boston College in 2019. That first year or so, he bounced between the practice squad and the active roster. He's been kind of buried on the Jets depth chart during his career with the team. He's played some special teams. He's played on some coverage units. He's seen some time as a gunner, seen some time on the kickoff coverage team. I think primarily he's been a special teamer. The Jets have had some injuries at receiver. He's kind of stepped up a couple times and seen playing time. There was a game in the 2022 season when the Jets were having issues with Elijah Moore where he saw pretty extensive playing time. But he's been a really kind of a depth player for the Jets, kind of a guy who's been on the back end of the roster for the team.
And is he primarily an outside guy or a slot guy, or does he do both?
He kind of does both. Again, he didn't play a whole lot, so it's kind of tough to say, but he's lined up in both spots during his time with the team.
Based on what you've seen from him when he has lined up with the offense, I mean, what are some of his strengths as far as route running? Can he run the whole tree, or is he limited to specific routes?
He actually flashed a little bit in that game, a game I was talking about. It seemed like in that particular game, he did a decent job reading what the coverages were and finding the soft spots in zone coverage. But, he's not a guy. The Jets really used him more as a special teamer. I think another thing to note about him is He actually played quarterback in college before he switched to receiver. Now, the Jets never really utilized that, but I have always wondered why the Jets did not try and utilize it a little bit more on gadget plays because he can throw the ball.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's certainly a talent to be with, maybe because of the difference in coaching staffs or stuff like that. I mean, so much turnover and whatnot. But let's talk more about his special teams play. You mentioned that he's done, I think, mostly the coverage teams, I think. Is primarily what he's done for special teams. He's played gunner, I assume, and what else has he done for specials?
He's covered on kickoffs. He hasn't. I haven't noticed anything particularly bad that he's done. I think he's an average special teamer. I wouldn't call him a special teams ace. This year the Jets had a guy, Justin Hardy, who played on their coverage units, and he actually tied for the league lead in tackles. Jeff Smith's not of that caliber. He's a guy who I think does the job that's asked of him. I don't know there's anything glaringly wrong with what Jeff Smith does, but I don't think he's a guy who necessarily you'd view as like a special teams ace. I think, if he makes the roster, it'll probably be, if you're looking for an extra receiver, somebody who can throw the ball and somebody who can, if it depends on what the Giants have in special teams, but I think this is really a back of the roster kind of guy, a guy who's going to be, probably a number 5, number 6 receiver if you don't have anybody else to fill that role.
What do you know about him as a locker room guy? What kind of locker room guy is he?
What I'll say about him is that the Jets had a coaching change back in 2020. It was his second year in the league. And, a guy like this who was an undrafted free agent, those guys tend not to last because if a lot of them tend not to last a coaching change, because if you're an undrafted free agent, you're probably somebody your coach picked out. He lasted 2 more years with Robert Saleh, and in a way, he wasn't particularly productive. It's not like he's a guy who played a major role on the Jets, but I think the fact that he lasted as long as he did probably speaks to something good about what the coaching staff thinks he brings to the locker room.
Were you surprised that the Jets didn't try to keep him?
No, I mean, he wasn't a key component of the team, and I don't mean to be derogatory at all towards Jeff Smith, but you look at the numbers. I mean, he wasn't an essential part of the team. And I think, especially when you're talking about near the back of the depth chart, if you've had a guy for 4 years and he hasn't really found a role on your team, usually you'll kind of move him out and you'll try and find someone younger to give those practice reps to. So I was expecting the Jets to move on.
But yet he did stay on the Jets for 4 years. So there had to be something about him that they liked.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think that there was some. I don't know what that something is. I don't think he was that productive, but in fact, this was earlier this year. That was one of. I went on a little bit of a rant on Locked On Jets about why he was getting so much playing time. So I do think the coaches liked him, but I think they looked at it and they evaluated it and they just felt like they're maybe a younger player. Maybe that roster spot could go. Now the Jets are maybe on the verge of signing Randall Cobb, so maybe it won't be a younger player, but I think they were ready to move forward. And I mean, the other thing is the Jets also had an offensive coordinator change. So, maybe this was a guy the old offensive coordinator, Mike LaFleur, liked, and maybe the new offensive coordinator, Nathaniel Hackett, wants to bring in somebody else for that roster spot.
Right. And how has he been as far as his durability goes? I know he hasn't played a whole lot, but, has he been pretty much durable for them?
I don't recall a lot of injuries, off the top of my head. This is not not an essential player for the Jets. So I think he's been fine as far as that goes. I can't remember many major injuries for him.
Yeah. Sounds like he's going to be more of a special teams player. I mean, the Giants certainly, they didn't have a solid gunner last year. And I believe that's a role he can play. And, like you said, he could probably give them some snaps here and there, as a 4 or 5 receiver, somebody at the bottom of the depth chart. But it's certainly an interesting pickup. Seems like a nice guy. I mean, we saw clips of him and he seems like a pretty, pleasant guy, a positive guy and whatnot. So, I mean, I don't know if that's your impression, your impressions of him, but seems like, a typical good locker room type of guy.
Yeah, and I think to stick around, when you're near the back of the roster, when you're in like that, the 47th, 48th, 49th guy, sometimes it's about what you bring in as far as the locker room goes. And, it seems like I've never heard anybody say anything bad about him.
Well, that's good to know. Well, we'll certainly get to see what he's all about when the Giants reconvene next month for the off-season program. Meanwhile, John, good luck to you with the Aaron Rodgers coverage. I'm sure that's been a zoo for you. A lot of interest with covering that. And
maybe one of these days they'll actually figure out the trade. It's a lot of waiting.
Wouldn't that be something if the trade didn't come down?
Well, that would be something else.
Oh boy. I do not envy you after what you went through. So, John, thank you so much for popping on the Locked On Giants podcast to let us know about Jeff Smith, the new wide receiver formerly with the Jets. Giant fans, stay tuned. We'll have more on today's show. Also, check out John's work over at Locked On Jets. He's got everything you need to know about the Aaron Rodgers saga and then some as the Jets look to rebuild that offense so that they have a powerhouse offense to match that powerhouse defense. And they look to make moves in the AFC East. So, John, thank you so much. Giant fans, we'll be right back after this. Hey, Giant fans, if you haven't done so already, check out FanDuel, America's #1 sports book, because new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 if their first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Then you can bet on everything from the money line to point scores to spreads and more. Plus, FanDuel even lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same-game parlay. So don't miss the chance to get your no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA, NFL, and more. Hey, Giant fans, don't forget to check out the Locked On Giants podcast on Instagram. You can find us at Locked On Giants, and also you can find me on Instagram at Patty Traina, PATTITRAINA. We have video clips, previews. We'll have OTA film, all kinds of cool stuff coming your way over the coming weeks and months. So don't forget, check us out on Instagram. All right, Giant fans, welcome back to the Locked On Giants podcast. I'm your host, Patricia Traina, and we are now going to answer a couple of listener-submitted questions. Before I do that, though, just a heads up on tomorrow's show. Nick Filato is going to join us. You know him, you love him just as much as I do. Nick Filato is going to join me. We're going to talk about free agency and how free agency has helped to set up the New York Giants draft. So you will not want to miss that podcast. Again, Nick Filato will be the special guest on Thursday's show. Check us out, please. All right, it's time to answer a couple of listener questions. These were submitted to me via Twitter. So if you want to submit a question for inclusion on the pod, whenever I have an open slot, I will answer the questions. And you can do so by either tweeting them to me at Patricia_Traina, TRAINA. Make sure you tag them with the hashtag AskPTrain so that they show up. They don't get lost in my notifications. Or if you want to email them to me, you can send them to lockedongiantspodcast@gmail.com. All that information is in the show notes below. So make a note of that. If you want to get in touch with me, happy to get your questions and try to answer them. All right, couple questions that have come in. James M. asks, what is the long-term cap outlook in your opinion? Good flexibility for the future, or has Joe Schoen fallen in love with and committed to the general structure of this team for a few years? All right, James, I'm not sure I understand the second part of your question there, but the long-term cap outlook, what Joe Schoen is trying to do is he's trying to clean up the situation to where they don't have to dump a lot of dead money into the cap. So, that's why you saw him in part take the hit on Kenny Galladay's contract this year rather than wait until post June 1st to save more money. You want to keep your dead money total low. Now, as far as the long-term cap outlook, James, it actually is going to change. For me to sit here and predict what it's going to look like and how much space they're going to have, people make this mistake all the time. They go to over the cap and they look at the cap space that's available. I mean, right now you look at 2024 and it says that the Giants have over 117 million in cap space. That number is going to go down. All right, because obviously the Giants are going to sign draft picks. They're going to sign guys on the roster to new contracts. So you can't sit here and get excited about that. Now, what you can look at is that the projected cap space for the league, the base cap space, is going to rise every year. So this year it's 224.8. Next year it's projected to be 256. In 2025, it's projected to be 282. And in 2026, it's projected to be $308 million. So what that means is that the contracts that maybe people are sitting here and saying, God, the Giants overpaid, those, when you stack it up into, 2024, 25, 26, the percentage of cap space it takes up isn't going to be that much. So for example, let's take Daniel Jones's contract, for example. I know a lot of people are like, oh my God, the Giants spent, $40 million per year on Daniel Jones. Well, to be honest with you, this year, Daniel Jones is only going to count for 9.2% of the cap. Next year, that number is going to raise to 17.6%. 2025, if he's still, on the team, 14%. And then in 2026, a year that I just don't think he's going to see, because at that point, I think the Giants are going to rip up the contract and either extend him at that point, or they'll move on from him depending on how he does. But he would only count for 18.3% of the cap. So as the number goes up, the percentage of the cap hit goes down. And I think as long as you keep a guy under 20% of your cap, you'll be fine. So that's a kind of a long roundabout way of answering that. I think the cap is going to be fine for the long term. But to sit here and say that for sure, knowing that there's going to be contract extensions, knowing that Andrew Thomas is going to get an extension, Dexter Lawrence is going to get an extension down the line, Thibodeau will get one, Ojulari will probably get one, so will McKinney probably. So it's hard to say what the market value is going to be for those guys until we actually get there. But I do think the Giants cap situation is headed in the right direction. It's better than it was last year. This year's cap I'm talking about, still not ideal, because right now the Giants, are going to have to clear some more space to make more moves. But I think it's going in the right direction. So I hope that answers your question. All right. This next one came from I'm a Ralph on Twitter, who writes, in last year's draft, the Giants picked Evan Neal over 3 or 4 other top college linemen whose name were in the mix. How did they all do during last season compared to Neal, who struggled at times? And was Neal the best choice? All right, Ralph, I don't think it's fair to evaluate a player after 1 year, a rookie after 1 year. All right. And in Neal's case, yes, he did struggle, but I will maintain this until I'm blue in the face, Giants blue in the face, that the knee injury that Evan Neal had to deal with in the second half of the season was a big factor as to why his mechanics and technique was all over the map. So I don't know that it's necessarily fair to make that comparison. And I'll go back to when Andrew Thomas, played his first year and everybody was screaming and saying, oh my God, the Giants, they made a mistake when they took Andrew Thomas because Tristan Wirfs was better. All these, Mekhi Becton was better. All these guys, that were in the class were better than him. Is anybody saying that now after seeing what Andrew Thomas did in year 2 and year 3? So I just don't think it's fair to sit there and say, oh, the Giants, missed the boat with Evan Neal, or, just make that comparison. Let's see what year 2 brings and year 3 brings. But, I would expect Evan Neal to really take a leap forward in year 2. Maybe on the same part, the same level as Andrew Thomas. I don't know, but I think he's going to get better. And I think if he stays healthy, he's going to be just fine. And, any second guessing that anybody has about whether or not the Giants messed up with that pick, it's going to go away. All right, Giant fans, that is going to do it for this edition of the Locked On Giants podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Again, check us out tomorrow. We are going to have Nick Filato on the show. We're going to talk about how the free agent moves fit in and how it is set up the Giants for the draft. And as I continue to bring you guests this week on the Locked On Giants podcast, hope you will tune in. And of course, those of you who catch us on YouTube, make sure you check out the shorts as we get breaking news. I'll do a quick video, put them on YouTube. And if you don't like YouTube, again, check out Instagram, because I'm putting them on Instagram. I'm also putting them on my TikTok account. So this way you are kept up to date. So until tomorrow, everybody, have a great one, and we will see you then.